October 16th, 1946. Nuremberg, Germany. 2:45 in the morning. 10 men are hanged inside the Nuremberg gymnasium, one by one. Each one, a name history will never forget. Goering, Ribbentrop, Keitel. But there is one man among them who walks to the gallows in near total silence. No final statement, no dramatic last words, no prayer. Just silence. A silence so complete, so eerie, that even the executioner, Master Sergeant John C. Woods, reportedly paused for a brief moment. His name was Alfred Rosenberg. Here is what separates him from every other Nazi who died that morning. The others pulled triggers, signed deportation orders, commanded death squads. But Rosenberg, he wrote ideas. He constructed an entire philosophical architecture, a blueprint of racial hatred so methodically reasoned that it gave the Holocaust its intellectual skeleton. Without Rosenberg, Hitler had rage. With Rosenberg, Hitler had theology. Then his personal diary, 400 pages of private confessions, doubts, and damning knowledge, vanished completely for 65 years. When it resurfaced in 2013, buried inside a dead lawyer's estate in Michigan, what investigators found inside rewrote everything historians thought they understood about who actually engineered the final solution. He has been called the most dangerous intellectual in human history. He has also been called a failed philosopher whom nobody seriously listened to. Both are true, and that contradiction is exactly what makes Alfred Rosenberg the most unsettling, most overlooked, and most urgently relevant figure the 20th century ever produced. The Making of a Monster, Origins and Ideology, January 12, 1893. Revel, Estonia. A city that couldn't decide what it was. Technically part of the Russian Empire, but its streets were German, its merchants were German, its schools taught in German, and the family that welcomed Alfred Ernst Rosenberg into the world that winter morning, they were German too, or at least, they desperately needed to believe they were. That desperation is where everything begins. Reval, today called Tallinn, was a city of layered identities and simmering resentments. The Baltic Germans occupied a strange middle position. Educated, cultured, proud, but surrounded by Russians who controlled the empire, by Estonians who resented German landlords, and by a Jewish merchant community viewed with a suspicion passed down through generations like poisoned heirlooms. Young Alfred absorbed all of it. The anxiety, the superiority complex sitting uncomfortably on top of a deeper insecurity, the obsessive need to define who belonged and who didn't. Then came the losses. His mother Elfriede died of tuberculosis when he was just 6 years old, 1899. His father, Waldemar, a prosperous shoe merchant, followed her to the grave shortly after, in 1904. Alfred was 11. He was raised by relatives, aunts, uncles, none quite prepared for the quiet, watchful boy who preferred books to people and ideology to friendship. By 1910, he enrolled at the Riga Polytechnic Institute to study architecture. The irony would not be lost on historians. A man trained to build, spent his life designing the ideological blueprints for destruction. But in Riga, the architecture was not what shaped him. It was the atmosphere. The Baltic provinces were seething with ethnic tensions. German-speaking elites like Rosenberg watched their status erode as Estonian and Latvian nationalism rose. The Jews, in Rosenberg's mind, conveniently were everywhere and nowhere, a scapegoat waiting to be named. Then came 1917. And everything changed. Rosenberg was completing his architectural studies in Moscow when the Bolshevik Revolution exploded in October. He was 24 years old. He witnessed the old order dismantled with terrifying speed, and he saw Jews, Leon Trotsky, Lev Kamenev, Grigory Zinoviev, prominently positioned in the Bolshevik leadership. In that moment, his mind made a connection that was historically dishonest, intellectually fraudulent, and catastrophically influential. He decided that Bolshevism and Judaism were the same thing. One organism, one conspiracy, one enemy, a lie. But a lie he would spend the rest of his life building into something that looked like truth. November 19th, 18. Germany surrendered in World War I. Estonia declared independence. Rosenberg, a Baltic German who identified with the defeated ruling class, suddenly had no homeland. He fled to Munich, arriving with no money, no connections, no future. Just a suitcase full of handwritten manuscripts. Rants against Jews, against Bolsheviks, against modernity itself. Munich in 1918 was a city in shock, defeated, humiliated, starving, the perfect incubator for extremist ideas. Then, sometime in 1919, Alfred Rosenberg walked into a beer hall and met Adolf Hitler. Hitler was 30 years old. Rosenberg was 26. By every conventional measure, both were failures. Hitler, the rejected art student turned angry veteran. Rosenberg, the stateless refugee with unpublished manuscripts. But when they spoke, something dangerous ignited. Hitler had passion without framework. Rosenberg had framework without passion. Together, they completed each other in the worst possible way. Hitler later credited Rosenberg with introducing him to the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a notorious anti-Semitic forgery which became a foundational propaganda weapon. By April 1921, Hitler had appointed Rosenberg editor of the Nazi Party newspaper, the Völkischer Beobachter. He was 28 years old. He now had a platform reaching hundreds of thousands of readers. He used every word to normalize hatred. And quietly, in the hours between editorial deadlines, he was writing something else, something bigger, a book. 700 pages of pseudo-history, racial mythology, and eliminationist philosophy that he believed would reshape Western civilization. He called it Der Mythos, this 20th century, the myth of the 20th century. It would become the second most read book in Nazi Germany, after Mein Kampf. Over 1 million copies in circulation by 1944. Read by teachers, judges, SS officers, men who would later stand in front of firing squads in gas chambers, believing they were fulfilling a racial destiny. Nobody knew yet what that book would eventually justify. They would find out soon enough. The Bible of Hatred, the myth of the 20th century, September 1st, 1930. Munich, Germany. A book hits the shelves that nobody fully understands and nobody can fully put down. It was 700 pages long, dense, rambling, frequently incomprehensible. It mixed Norse mythology with fake archaeology, twisted art history with biological racism, and wrapped all of it in the kind of academic-sounding language that made dangerous nonsense feel like serious scholarship. Alfred Rosenberg had spent nearly a decade writing it. He titled it Der Mythos des 20th Century, and within a decade of publication, it would become the second most widely distributed book in all of Nazi Germany, surpassed only by Hitler's Mein Kampf. So what exactly was inside those 700 pages? Rosenberg's central argument was seductively simple, historically fraudulent, and morally catastrophic. He claimed that every great civilization in human history, ancient Greece, Rome, the Renaissance, the Nordic kingdoms, had been built by a single, superior racial group he called the Nordic Aryan race. And every time that civilization collapsed, every time greatness crumbled into decay, the cause was the same: racial contamination. Jewish influence poisoning the bloodstream of cultures that had forgotten how to protect themselves. He didn't present this as opinion. He presented it as science, as archaeology, as art criticism, as theological history. He pulled real historical figures: Meister Eckhart, Leonardo da Vinci, even Jesus Christ, whom he recast as an Aryan warrior rather than a Jewish rabbi, and fitted them into his framework like pieces of a puzzle that had been deliberately cut to only fit one picture. It was intellectually dishonest on virtually every page. And here is where the story takes a turn that historians still find genuinely astonishing. Even the people closest to Rosenberg couldn't stand it. Adolf Hitler, the man Rosenberg considered his ideological soulmate, privately told associates the book was unreadable. Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda chief, wrote in his diary on February 7, 1930, that the book was a philosophical belch and that Rosenberg had produced something that nobody can understand. Heinrich Himmler reportedly struggled through it and gave up. Even within the Nazi inner circle, Der Mythos was treated as an embarrassment. And yet, and this is the part that should stop you cold, by 1944, the Nazi Party had distributed over 1 million copies. Catholic and Protestant churches formally condemned it. Universities across Europe were forced to engage with its arguments. It appeared on school reading lists. It was cited in legal documents justifying anti-Jewish legislation, which forces a question that cuts right to the heart of how ideological violence actually works. Does an idea need to be believed to be weaponized? The answer, Rosenberg proved, is no. It doesn't. An idea only needs to be repeated, distributed, institutionalized, made official. Once a lie is wearing a government uniform, nobody stops to ask whether anyone actually believes it. Throughout the 1920s and into the 1930s, Rosenberg had been doing exactly this through the Völkischer Beobachter, the Nazi Party's official newspaper, which he edited from 1921 onward. Day after day, edition after edition, the paper ran stories that portrayed Jewish Germans as criminals, as conspirators, as existential parasites. By January 30th, 1933, the day Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, millions of ordinary Germans had been reading this newspaper for over a decade. The hatred hadn't arrived overnight. It had been delivered to their doorsteps every morning with their coffee. That is how Rosenberg worked. Slowly, systematically, philosophically. And by 1933, the philosophy was ready to become policy. The ideas that had lived inside 700 pages of dense racial theory were about to climb down off the bookshelf. They were about to put on uniforms, pick up weapons, board trains heading east. What happened next would be recorded in history as the darkest chapter of the 20th century. And Alfred Rosenberg would have a desk, a title, and a direct hand in every single part of it. The Eastern Laboratory, Reich Minister for the Occupied Eastern Territories, July 17, 1941. Berlin, Adolf Hitler signs a decree that hands one man administrative control over a territory larger than Western Europe. That man is Alfred Rosenberg, and his new title is Reich Minister for the Occupied Eastern Territories. 3 weeks earlier, on June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa had launched, the largest military invasion in human history, sending over 3 million German soldiers crashing across the Soviet border into Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, and deep into Russian territory. The Wehrmacht was moving fast, and Hitler needed someone to govern everything left behind the front lines. Someone who had spent 20 years theorizing about what Eastern Europe was supposed to become. Someone ideologically trusted. He chose Rosenberg. Over 70 million human beings now lived inside his administrative domain. 70 million people who, in Rosenberg's own published writings, barely qualified as human at all. He had spent 2 decades writing about racial destiny. Now, for the first time, he had the machinery to enforce it. His ministry immediately began drafting what would become one of the most chilling documents in the history of warfare. General Plan Ost, the general plan for the East. Its numbers were staggering even by Nazi standards. Approximately 30 to 45 million Slavic people were to be removed from their homelands through deportation, forced starvation, and outright extermination. German and Nordic settlers would then colonize the emptied land, creating what Nazi ideology called Lebensraum, living space, for the master race. It wasn't a battle plan, it was a continental redesign, written in offices, signed by bureaucrats, executed by soldiers with rifles and gas vans. But Rosenberg didn't wait for the long-term plan to unfold. The killing had already begun. In the spring and summer of 1941, Nazi leadership, with Rosenberg's ministerial authorization, implemented what historians now call the Hunger Plan. It was exactly what the name suggests, a deliberate, calculated policy to starve Soviet prisoners of war and civilians to death, systematically redirecting food resources toward German forces and away from the occupied population. By the end of 1941, conditions inside Soviet POW camps had descended into something medieval. Men ate grass pulled from between fence posts. Then they ate leather. Then, in documented cases that would later be presented at Nuremberg, they ate each other. By the close of 1942, an estimated 3.3 million Soviet prisoners of war were dead, not from combat, from deliberate starvation. Rosenberg's signature was on the authorizing documents. And then came Babi Yar, September 29, 1941, a ravine on the outskirts of Kyiv, Ukraine. The Einsatzgruppen mobile death squads operating directly within Rosenberg's territorial jurisdiction marched 33,771 Jewish men, women, and children to the edge of that ravine over 2 days and shot every single one of them. It remains one of the single largest mass shootings in the entire history of the Holocaust. Among those forced to the edge was a woman named Dina Pronicheva, a 30-year-old actress. She fell into the ravine before the bullet reached her. She lay still, beneath the bodies of the dead for hours. Then she crawled out after dark, covered in blood that wasn't hers, and survived. She testified at Soviet war crimes trials in 1946. Her account is one of the most devastating pieces of eyewitness testimony in recorded history. Rosenberg filed no complaint about Babi Yar, not one. But here's what almost nobody knows. Rosenberg was, in fact, filing complaints during this period, just not about the massacres. He was complaining about Erich Koch, his own subordinate and Reich Commissioner for Ukraine, whom he despised with a bureaucratic fury that bordered on obsession. Koch was brutal even by Nazi standards, openly contemptuous of Rosenberg, calling him publicly a dreamer who had never run a chicken farm. Koch ignored Rosenberg's directives entirely, treating Ukraine as a personal extraction colony rather than following Rosenberg's slightly more calculated exploitation strategy. Rosenberg also clashed repeatedly with Heinrich Himmler, whose SS controlled the Einsatzgruppen and operating inside Rosenberg's territory. By 1943, Himmler had effectively won that internal power struggle. Rosenberg was increasingly a minister without an army, issuing directives that nobody enforced, writing memos that nobody read. And so, he kept writing. Formal complaints, bureaucratic protests, carefully worded objections about methodology and efficiency. Not about the genocide itself. Never about that. The genocide was the point. The genocide was the plan. His objections were purely logistical. The methods he believed were generating unnecessary civilian resistance that complicated the occupation. The killing wasn't the problem. The inefficiency was. That single distinction, more than any other detail in his entire biography, reveals exactly what Alfred Rosenberg was. Not a reluctant participant, not a man trapped by circumstance. A man so completely consumed by his own ideology that mass murder had become, in his mind, an administrative matter, a question of proper execution, not of whether to execute at all. And somewhere in his ministry, in a locked drawer, a diary was filling up with all of it. The Thief of Civilization, Operation Air, and the greatest art heist in history, July 19th, 40, Paris, France. The city of light is dark. 5 weeks earlier, on June 22, 1940, France had surrendered. The streets, once filled with artists and the most vibrant Jewish intellectual community in Western Europe, now held Wehrmacht soldiers and swastikas. And Alfred Rosenberg, watching from Berlin, saw an opportunity, a continent full of culture. He wanted to take it. That same month, with Hitler's personal authorization, Rosenberg established the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, the EAR. On paper, a cultural research unit. In reality, the most sophisticated organized theft operation in human history. Its mission was devastatingly simple. Move through occupied Europe like a vacuum, seizing art, books, archives, and cultural treasures, primarily from Jewish families, and ship everything to Germany. Hitler wanted masterpieces for a planned museum in Linz. Goering wanted paintings for his estate. Rosenberg wanted something more disturbing: ammunition. Between 1940 and 1944, the EAR operated across France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Greece, and the Eastern Territories. The scale is almost impossible to process. An estimated 600,000 works of art, 2.5 million books, entire institutional archives representing centuries of Jewish intellectual life. The legendary Rothschild collection in Paris, Vermeer, Rembrandt, Boucher, stripped from family homes. The YIVO Institute in Vilnius, one of the world's greatest centers of Jewish scholarship, ransacked. Over 100 boxcars of stolen culture rolled east into the Reich, each one a civilization in pieces. In 1941, Rosenberg traveled personally to Paris to inspect the operation. He walked through the Jeu de Paume Museum, a grand gallery converted into a sorting depot, its elegant rooms stacked floor to ceiling with crated paintings. He looked at the stolen Rembrandts, the looted Vermeers. He did not see crime. He saw research material. The Jews, in his worldview, were going to be destroyed, but their culture, their texts, their art would be preserved, cataloged, studied, used to prove his racial theories. You would keep what he was killing. The books received especially revealing treatment. Thousands were pulped, converted to raw paper for the German war machine. But Rosenberg personally directed that approximately 500,000 volumes be preserved for a planned institute in Frankfurt, the Institute for Research on the Jewish Question. He intended to use Jewish sacred texts as evidence of Jewish degeneracy. He would prove his case against an entire people using the very books they considered holy. He preserved what he otherwise wanted to burn. After the war, a remarkable group of Allied soldiers, art historians, museum curators, architects in uniform began the staggering task of recovery. The Monuments Men. Working through 1945 and 1946, they recovered over 5 million cultural objects stolen by the Nazis, locating hidden caches in salt mines, castles, and remote barns. But here is what the documentaries don't always tell you. Thousands of works remain missing. Paintings confirmed in AR inventories, Vermeer, Rembrandt, Botticelli, last documented in Nazi hands in 1944 and never recovered. As recently as 2022, restitution cases were still being argued in European courts. The looting never fully ended, and that forces a question no historian has ever fully resolved. Rosenberg wanted to erase Jewish life from Europe, physically, permanently. He helped design the administrative framework that sent millions to their deaths, and yet he preserved Jewish culture, in stolen form, locked in German institutions, cataloged under German labels. Is that preservation? Or is it the most complete form of desecration imaginable? To murder a people and then keep their prayer books as trophies? Is a stolen Torah scroll sitting in a Nazi archive more obscene than a burned one? There is no comfortable answer. And Rosenberg never lost a single night's sleep over the question. But somewhere, in a locked door inside his ministry, his diary was recording all of it. Every decision, every justification, every doubt he refused to speak aloud. And that diary was about to disappear for 65 years. The collapse in the diary, what the paper trail revealed. In 1944, Berlin, the 1,000-year Reich, is dying. And Alfred Rosenberg knows it. The Eastern Front is collapsing. The Allies have landed in Normandy. Inside the ministries, arrogance has turned to quiet panic. And Rosenberg, the man who once controlled 70 million lives, is sitting at his desk writing memos. Long, detailed, carefully reasoned memos about administrative boundaries that no longer exist, about settlement programs for territories already recaptured by the Soviets. His subordinates don't read them. His rivals, Himmler, Goebbels, Bormann, have stopped returning his correspondence. Even Hitler has effectively stopped acknowledging him. But every night, in private, he was writing something else. Rosenberg had maintained a personal diary since 1936, 425 handwritten pages. In it, he recorded his resentment of Himmler, his wounded pride at being sidelined, his conviction that his ideas had been stolen. And scattered throughout those pages were entries that would become the most legally significant documents at Nuremberg. On October 25, 1941, Rosenberg noted a meeting about the final solution. He wrote the phrase in his own handwriting. He knew precisely what it meant. The paper trail was complete. He had written his own conviction. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, Rosenberg fled north. On May 17th, American soldiers found him hiding in a schoolhouse near Flensburg. He was wearing a threadbare coat, carrying a satchel of papers. He had lost weight. His hands trembled. When asked his name, he reportedly said, "I am Alfred Rosenberg. I am the man you were looking for." Cooperative, calm, almost relieved. But the diary wasn't with him. It had been taken by Robert Kempner, a German Jewish lawyer who fled the Nazis in 1935, returned as a Nuremberg prosecutor, and simply kept the diary after the trials. For decades, 425 pages of one of the most important historical documents of the 20th century sat in a paper bag, mixed with Christmas decorations, in the garage of a private residence in Michigan. For 65 years, historians knew the diary had existed. They had no idea where it was. Then, in 2013, federal agents tracked it down. What they found electrified the historical community. Not because it revealed new atrocities, the facts were long established, but because it revealed the man behind the ideology. With psychological intimacy, no trial transcript ever had. There is not a single line of remorse in 425 pages. Not one moment of horror at what his theories had produced.
Adam Callens. We would be given the right to men on Adam Callens.
What fills those pages instead is wounded ego, petty rivalry, the unshakable private conviction that he had been right about everything. That is the most disturbing revelation the diary contains. Not the evidence of guilt, the complete, undisturbed absence of doubt. On November 20th, 1945, the Nuremberg trials opened. Rosenberg took a seat in the dock, not among the military commanders, but among the ideologies. For the first time in his life, he would have to answer for every sentence he had ever written. The gallows and the question that remains. Guilt, legacy, and the danger of ideas. November 20th, 1945. Nuremberg, Germany. The International Military Tribunal opens its first session. Hermann Goering enters first, resplendent in his tailored uniform, stripped of his medals but still carrying himself like a Reichsmarschall. Rudolf Hess follows, hollow-eyed and silent, a man who flew to Scotland on a deranged peace mission and never fully returned to sanity. And then comes Alfred Rosenberg, wire-rimmed glasses, a dark suit that hangs loosely on his frame, a notepaper in his hands. He takes his seat in the dock, not among the military commanders, but among the ideologists, the architects, the men who had built the framework that made everything else possible. He looks less like a war criminal than a professor who has wandered into the wrong lecture hall. He takes notes on the proceedings. He adjusts his glasses. He watches the men who pulled triggers with the detached curiosity of a man who believes he belongs in a different category entirely. That belief was his defense. Over the course of the 10-month trial, Rosenberg's legal strategy were simple, consistent, and from the perspective of the prosecutors, almost incomprehensible. He argued that he was a theorist, not an executioner, that his ideas had been misapplied by others, that he had never killed anyone, never given a direct order to murder, never personally operated an Einsatzgruppen death squad, or pushed the button on a gas chamber. I was a librarian, he told his interrogators at one point. I moved papers from one desk to another. The prosecutors opened Rosenberg's own diary. They read his October 25, 1941 entry about the final solution, written in his own handwriting, in his own private record, at a time when he was actively administering the Eastern Territories, where Einsatzgruppen death squads were massacring Jewish communities. They presented his signed orders authorizing the seizure of Jewish property. They showed the hunger plan he had helped authorize, a deliberate policy to starve Soviet prisoners and civilians that had killed an estimated 3.3 million Soviet POWs by 1942 alone. They placed before the court the administrative framework he had designed for General Plan Ost, the demographic restructuring of Eastern Europe through starvation, deportation, and extermination. You moved papers, the prosecutor said, that ordered the murder of millions. Rosenberg had no answer. October 1, 1946, the judges return their verdicts. Rosenberg is called forward. The court finds him guilty on all 4 counts: conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, planning and initiating wars of aggression, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The man who wrote sentences is sentenced to death. October 16th, 1946. 2:45 in the morning, the Nuremberg Gymnasium, converted into a makeshift execution chamber. 10 men are scheduled to hang. He is led up the 13 wooden steps to the gallows platform. The hangman, Master Sergeant John C. Woods, asks if he has any final words. Rosenberg stares straight ahead. No statement, no dramatic last words, no prayer, no confession. Just silence. A silence so complete, so absolute, that even the executioner, a man who had hanged dozens of convicted war criminals, reportedly paused for a moment. Then the black hood is placed over his head. The trapdoor opens. The rope snaps taut. His last written words, found in this cell afterward: I die innocent. My only crime was loyalty. But here's the question that followed Rosenberg to the gallows, and that has never stopped following him since.
The Nuremberg prosecutors struggled with Rosenberg because he didn't fit the standard categories of war criminal. He hadn't pulled a trigger. He hadn't signed a single deportation order with his own name on it. He hadn't commanded a death squad or inspected a concentration camp. He had written sentences that men with guns read and acted upon, sentences that gave an entire civilization permission to commit atrocities. The question the courtroom could never fully resolve was this: can an idea be a war crime? And if an idea can be a crime, then what does that say about the person who writes it and the person who reads it and believes? Where does responsibility begin? Where does it end? Is the theorist more guilty than the soldier who pulls the trigger? or less guilty? Or is guilt something that cannot be measured along such a simple line? Rosenberg's body was cremated. His ashes were scattered in an undisclosed location. No grave, no marker. He had requested no monument. He got what he requested. But his idea never died. The myth of the 20th century never stopped circulating. Long after the Third Reich was reduced to rubble and courtroom transcripts, Rosenberg's texts continued to appear in extremist networks across the globe. White nationalist forums in the 1990s shared PDFs of his work. As recently as 2017, his writings were being cited in online communities dedicated to the same racial ideologies he had helped systematize. His books have been translated into English, Russian, Arabic. The architect is gone. The architect is gone. Where do you find books or sending? The architecture remains. The 2013 discovery and publication of his diary added a final layer to the historical record. Scholars who studied the complete document concluded what Rosenberg's trial testimony had tried to obscure. He knew. He knew about the extermination program while it was happening. He knew about the Einsatzgruppen massacres in his own territories. He knew about the hunger plan's death toll. And he never once, in 425 pages of private writing, expressed a single moment of doubt about whether any of it was wrong. Not about the murders, not about the looting, not about the starvation of millions of prisoners. The only doubts he recorded were about his own career advancement and his resentment of rivals who had outmaneuvered him. That is perhaps the most disturbing revelation the diary contains, not the evidence of guilt, the complete undisturbed absence of doubt. Alfred Rosenberg proves something that the world has never fully learned to accept. The most dangerous weapon in human history is not a gun. It is not a bomb. It is not a gas chamber. It is a sentence, written with enough conviction, read by enough people, at exactly the right moment of civilizational desperation. He did not fire a single shot, and millions died. That is why his story is not history. It is a warning.